Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The kitchen was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I had just finished dinner, pasta, nothing fancy, and was scrolling through emails on my phone when a message popped up from Mark. Mark rarely texted. Usually, it was reminders or orders. Don't forget to pick up the dry cleaning. Where's my blue tie? I stared at his name for a second, wondering what he could want now. When I opened it, my heart didn't stop, it froze. Hey babe, just a heads up, I'm leaving you. Moving to Miami with my new 20-year-old babe. Don't worry, I already emptied the joint account. Huh, good luck. I read it 3 times. The words, emptied the joint account, felt like a punch to the gut. The haha was salt in the wound. My husband of 15 years had just nuked our marriage in a single text, and he was laughing about it. But here's the thing, I didn't cry. I didn't scream or throw my phone against the wall like some dramatic scene in a movie. I sat there, the fork still in my hand, and something inside me shifted. I texted back, good luck. Short, simple, and nothing like what he'd expect from me. Mark has always underestimated me. He thinks I'm quiet, naive, too soft to stand up to him. And maybe for a long time he was right. I let him control the money, the decisions, the narrative of our marriage. He was the loud one, the charming one, the one who knew how to make people laugh, and how to make me feel small. But that text, that wasn't just betrayal. That was the last straw. The next morning, I woke up early and my mind buzzing. I made coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and pulled out my laptop. First, I logged into our bank account. The balance was exactly what I expected. 0. Mark had cleaned it out just like he said he would. I took a deep breath and opened my own personal account. Mark doesn't know everything. For years, I've been tucking away little bits of money from freelance projects, birthday checks from my mom, and bonuses he didn't bother to ask about. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Then I dug out our financial documents. I hadn't looked at them in years, but I remembered where they were, a dusty box in the closet labeled Mark's papers. I flipped through until I found the prenuptial agreement. Mark was so smug when we signed it. It's just a formality, he'd said, his grin as big as the day we met. I'm not going anywhere, Em. And yet, here we were. As I read through the prenup, I spotted something that made my heart race. A clause about infidelity and financial misconduct. If either party was found guilty of either, the wrong party got full control of joint assets and properties. Mark must have forgotten about that little detail. Or maybe he assumed I'd never think to use it. Meanwhile, Mark was already posting his new life all over social media. His Instagram was a shrine to his Miami fantasy. Poolside selfies, overpriced cocktails, and his 20-year-old babe, who had a pout that could sink a ship. Living my best life, he wrote under a photo of himself on a yacht. I scrolled through his posts, disgusted but also amused. Mark always thought his arrogance was an asset. He didn't realize it was a giant flashing neon sign pointing directly at his weaknesses. I spent the next few days putting my plan together. First, I called the bank to freeze our business accounts. Mark had emptied the joint checking account, but he'd forgotten about the business line of credit tied to our shared investments. By the time he noticed, it'd be too late. Next, I canceled the credit cards in my name. I pictured Mark at some swanky Miami restaurant, trying to pay for a bottle of champagne, only to have his card declined. Finally, I gathered evidence, screenshots of his text, records of his spending, and every obnoxious Instagram post he'd made. I wanted a full arsenal by the time I went to my lawyer. By the end of the week, I was ready. Mark thought he'd left me powerless, but he had no idea. That night, I sat at the same kitchen table, staring at my laptop. The house was quiet except for the soft tick of the clock on the wall. I took a sip of wine and smiled to myself. Good luck, Mark, I whispered. While Mark parties in Miami, convinced he's won, I've set the wheels in motion. He doesn't know it yet, but the game has already started, and I'm the one holding all the cards. When you spend 15 years with someone, you learn their patterns, their habits, their weaknesses. Mark thought I didn't notice the way he'd talk over me at dinner parties or dismiss my ideas as cute when I shared them. But I noticed. I just chose my battles carefully. Mark had a knack for making himself look good in front of others. At home, though, that was a different story. It wasn't always bad. I still remember the Mark who brought me flowers just because it was Tuesday, the Mark who stayed up late helping me paint the spare bedroom in our first house. That Mark felt like a partner. But somewhere along the way, things changed. Maybe it was when his career took off, and mine stalled. I was freelancing, picking up side gigs that gave me flexibility, but to Mark, that wasn't enough. When are you going to find something real? He'd ask, as if my work didn't count. Or maybe it was when we started going to events where he'd introduce me as just my wife. Not Emma, not his partner, just his wife. The cracks weren't sudden, they were slow, creeping. And for years, I ignored them, telling myself that all marriages had rough patches. One night, a few years ago, I brought up the idea of starting my own business. I had saved up enough to get started, and I was excited to share my plans with him. Mark didn't even look up from his phone. A boutique? Really? Don't you think that market's oversaturated? You'd probably lose more than you'd make. His words stung, but I laughed it off, telling myself he was just being practical. That's what Mark did. He was practical, logical. But now, looking back, I see what I didn't want to admit then. Mark wasn't protecting me from failure. He was protecting his own ego. Have you ever trusted someone so deeply that you ignored the signs they weren't who you thought they were? What did you do when you finally realized it? The day after Mark's text, I sat down with a box of documents I hadn't touched in years. It was labeled Mark stuff, but inside, I found everything from our mortgage papers to insurance policies to the prenup. The prenup. I hadn't thought about it in ages. Back when we got married, Mark insisted on it, saying it was just a safeguard for his career assets. I didn't mind at the time. I didn't have much to protect, and I trusted him. But as I read through it now, something jumped out at me. There was in black and white, a clause about infidelity and financial misconduct. If either party was found guilty, the wrong spouse would retain full control of joint assets and properties. I couldn't believe it. Mark had been so confident when we signed it, so sure that I'd never challenge him. I sat back, the weight of what I just read sinking in. Mark thought he held all the cards. He thought emptying the joint account was the end of the story. But he had no idea I had this. I didn't waste any time. I made an appointment with a lawyer the next morning. Sitting across from her in the sleek, minimalist office, I laid out everything. Mark's text, the empty bank account, and the clause in the prenup. She listened carefully, her expression unreadable as she flipped through the paperwork. This clause is enforceable, she said finally, setting the documents down. But it's going to require proof. Evidence of infidelity, financial misconduct, anything that supports your case. I've got proof, I said, pulling out a folder of screenshots and bank statements. Mark left a trail a mile wide. Her lips curved into a faint smile. He doesn't sound like the sharpest tool in the shed. He's not, I replied, a flicker of satisfaction warming my chest. We spent the next hour outlining the steps we'd take. Asset freezes, legal notices, and a formal investigation into his finances. It wouldn't be quick, and it wouldn't be easy, but I was ready. As I left the lawyer's office, the weight I'd been carrying since Mark's text felt a little lighter. Mark probably thought I was sitting at home, crying into a bottle of wine. He had no idea that I was already dismantling his Miami fantasy, piece by piece. As I walked back to my car, I caught my reflection in the window of a nearby shop. I looked different, sharper, more determined. Mark had underestimated me, but he was about to learn the hard way. Mark has always been his own biggest fan. I used to admire that confidence, but now it's his Achilles heel. From the moment he landed in Miami, his Instagram became a non-stop highlight reel of his new life. There he was, lounging by the pool, martini in hand. There he was again, on the deck of a rented yacht with his babe, who never seemed to look up from her phone. "Living my best life," read one caption under a picture of him flexing in front of a Lamborghini. The posts were obnoxious, sure, but they were also gold mines. Mark didn't just flaunt his lifestyle. He broadcasted every move he made, every dollar he spent. He had no idea I was watching, collecting receipts with the precision of a hawk circling its prey. The first thing I did was call the credit card companies. Mark had left the accounts tied to my name wide open, probably assuming I wouldn't think to touch them. Big mistake. It took less than 20 minutes to cancel every card he had in his wallet. I imagined the look on his face the next time he tried to pay for another round of overpriced cocktails. Next, I moved on to the properties. The house, which was technically in both our names, was still legally under my control. I had already consulted my lawyer, who confirmed that Mark couldn't sell or lease it without my permission. While he was busy partying in Miami, I changed the locks and had the utilities cut off. By the time he realized he couldn't waltz back in whenever he pleased, it would be too late. Freezing the remaining assets was trickier, but not impossible. Mark had drained the joint account, but he'd left behind a trail of transactions that made his intentions clear. My lawyer filed an emergency injunction to protect what was left of our shared investments. And within days, the accounts were locked down. Every move I made felt like regaining a piece of myself. For years, I let Mark dictate the terms of our life together. Now, I was rewriting the rules. Mark, of course, had no clue. He was too busy living his best life to notice the walls closing in. In one particularly tone-deaf post, he bragged about a business investment he'd made in Miami, a flashy nightclub that screamed midlife crisis. I couldn't help but laugh. Mark barely had enough sense to balance a checkbook, and now he thought he could run a nightclub? I sent the post to my lawyer, who suggested hiring a private investigator to dig deeper into Mark's financial dealings. A few days later, the investigator called with news. "I've found something interesting," he said, his voice calm but purposeful. "Mark's been moving money into offshore accounts." I froze. "Offshore accounts? Since when?" "Since before he left for Miami," the investigator replied. "It's not a huge amount, but enough to raise questions. He's also using a shell company to funnel some of his spending." My grip on the phone tightened. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about uncovering the full extent of Mark's lies. "Send me everything you have," I said. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, poring over the investigator's findings. The offshore accounts, the shell company, the nightclub investment, it was all part of a larger pattern. Mark hadn't just blindsided me with his betrayal. He'd been planning it for months, maybe longer. Every dollar he'd hidden, every account he'd opened, was another step in his escape plan. And yet, he was careless, arrogant. He thought I wouldn't notice, wouldn't fight back. He was wrong. By the end of the night, I had a new plan. I wasn't just going to freeze Mark's assets. I was going to expose him for the liar and cheat he really was. I stared at the investigator's report one last time before closing my laptop. Mark had spent years underestimating me, but now it was my turn to take control. As I prepared to move forward, one question lingered in my mind. How much more was Mark hiding? The investigator's findings hinted at deeper secrets, and I was determined to uncover them all. When the lawsuit was officially filed, it felt like the first deep breath I'd taken in weeks. My lawyer, Rebecca, had been meticulous, outlining every step with precision. She didn't just want to reclaim what Mark had stolen. She wanted to ensure he had no room to wriggle out of accountability. The documents were ironclad. Between the prenup, the records of his financial misconduct, and the damning details from the investigator's report, we had built an airtight case. "You've got this, Emma," Rebecca said, sliding the final draft of the filing across the desk to me. "Once this lands, Mark won't know what hit him." I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. "Let's do it." Meanwhile, Mark's Instagram told a different story. The man was practically dancing on a financial tightrope, unaware the net below him was about to be yanked away. His posts grew more obnoxious by the day. Pictures of his new business ventures, shots of his girlfriend draped in designer clothing, and captions that screamed midlife crisis. "Winners focus on winning. Haters focus on me." It would have been funny if it weren't so infuriating. Mark still thought he was untouchable. He probably imagined I was at home, crying into a glass of wine, mourning the life he'd so smugly walked away from. But he couldn't have been more wrong. The notice of the lawsuit was sent to Mark's Miami address. It included a demand for the return of the stolen funds, an injunction against his hidden assets, and an investigation into his offshore accounts. It also came with a freeze on his nightclub investment, effectively halting his latest attempt at reinvention. The best part? The notice was served on a Friday, right before one of his big social events. That Friday evening, while Mark was out celebrating himself, I was back at home, sipping tea and watching an old movie. The investigator had already texted me updates. "Notice served. He'll get it tonight. Brace yourself for fireworks." I wasn't sure how Mark would react, but I knew one thing. He wouldn't take it quietly. Sure enough, my phone buzzed later that night. "Emma, what the hell is this?" The sheer audacity of his outrage made me laugh out loud. He had drained our account, run off with his girlfriend, and tried to hide money from me. And now he was furious? I didn't respond right away. I wanted him to sit with it, to feel the panic sink in as he realized what was happening. The next morning, Mark called. I let it go to voicemail. His message was equal parts anger and desperation. "This is ridiculous, Emma. You can't do this to me. You think you're so clever, but you have no idea what you're up against. Call me back." I played the message twice, marveling at his arrogance. Even now, with his Miami empire starting to crumble, he still thought he held the upper hand. By Monday, the fallout began. The nightclub deal Mark had been bragging about was officially suspended, thanks to the injunction. His Instagram posts abruptly stopped, and I couldn't help but imagine him scrambling to figure out his next move. Rebecca kept me updated on the legal progress. "Mark's lawyer has reached out," she said during one of our meetings. "They're trying to negotiate, but we're not backing down." "What's their angle?" I asked. "They're claiming the offshore accounts were a misunderstanding, and they want to settle quietly. But we have the prenup and the evidence. He doesn't have much leverage. Mark's arrogance was his downfall. He had underestimated me at every turn, assuming I'd fold under pressure. But now, for the first time, he was on the defensive. My favorite moment came when I heard from one of our mutual acquaintances, a woman named Lisa, who had always been friendly, but not particularly close. Emma, I just wanted to say, good for you, she said. Everyone's talking about what you're doing. It's about time someone knocked Mark off his pedestal. Her words were a balm for my frayed nerves. I didn't set out to make this public, but the idea that people were starting to see the real Mark felt like a small victory. A few days later, Mark sent another text. This one was shorter, but the shift in tone was obvious. Emma, let's talk. We can work something out. Call me? I stared at the message, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to call and hear him squirm, but I knew better. Mark didn't deserve the satisfaction of my attention. Not yet. Instead, I forwarded the message to Rebecca. Mark's Miami dream was unraveling, and he was finally starting to feel the pressure. But I knew there was more to uncover. The investigators' findings hinted at deeper secrets, and I wasn't done digging. Not by a long shot. Mark's life in Miami wasn't quite as glamorous as he'd hoped anymore. With his accounts frozen and his nightclub deal in limbo, his carefully curated image was starting to crack. I could almost picture him pacing his overpriced condo, barking into his phone as he tried to figure out what went wrong. His Instagram, once filled with boastful posts, had gone suspiciously silent. The last update, a blurry photo of a fancy cocktail, had no caption, no smug tagline. I didn't need to see him to know he was panicking. It wasn't long before I started hearing whispers. Lisa, the mutual acquaintance who'd called to congratulate me earlier, sent me a text one afternoon. You didn't hear this from me, but Mark's girlfriend's been telling people she's sick of him. Apparently, being a trophy isn't as fun when the credit cards don't work. I laughed out loud when I read it. The irony was almost too much. Mark had risked everything for this young, shiny relationship, and now it was falling apart at the seams. But if I was honest, the humor didn't completely dull the ache. One evening, I sat alone at the kitchen table, nursing a glass of wine as I scrolled through my files. The investigator had sent over another batch of documents earlier that day, more proof of Mark's financial misconduct. As I scanned the spreadsheets and bank statements, a wave of exhaustion washed over me. Not physical exhaustion, but the kind that settles deep in your soul. For years, I convinced myself that Mark and I were a team, that our marriage had cracks but no real fractures. I told myself his arrogance was just confidence, his dismissiveness a quirk I could overlook. I thought back to all the little moments I'd ignored, the times he made jokes at my expense in front of friends, the way he dismissed my ideas as cute instead of taking them seriously. Why had I stayed? The answer was complicated, and I wasn't sure I wanted to unpack it fully. But I knew one thing. Whatever Mark and I had, it was gone long before he sent that text. Have you ever stayed in a situation you knew wasn't right, hoping things would get better? What made you finally leave? As Mark's panic grew, so did his attempts to contact me. The text came daily now, a mix of anger, desperation, and hollow apologies. You don't have to do this, Emma. Let's talk. We can figure this out. Why are you being so cruel? I thought you were better than this. That last one made me laugh. Better than this? Mark was the one who drained our account, ran off with his girlfriend, and flaunted his betrayal like it was a badge of honor. I ignored every message, forwarding them all to Rebecca. By the second week of the asset freeze, the cracks in Mark's facade were more visible than ever. Lisa called again, this time with more juicy details. Apparently, he tried to rent out his condo to make some quick cash, she said, barely able to contain her glee. But the building's HOA blocked it. He's scrambling. It wasn't hard to imagine. For years, Mark had built his life around appearances, making sure he looked successful even if it meant stretching the truth. Now, with no money to back him up, the illusion was crumbling. That night, as I reviewed my notes, an email popped up in my inbox. The subject line read, "You need to see this." There was no name, just an anonymous address. My heart raced as I opened it, half expecting it to be spam. But it wasn't. The email contained an attachment, a series of documents and screenshots that sent my mind spinning. It wasn't just the offshore accounts or the stolen money. Mark had been skimming from my inheritance for years, quietly siphoning funds into his own accounts under the guise of investments. I sat back, my hands shaking. This wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage. It was a betrayal of trust that ran deeper than I could have imagined. The email changed everything. Mark hadn't just blindsided me with his text. He'd been betraying me for years. And now, I had the proof to expose him completely. The email sat open on my screen, the documents staring back at me like ghosts from a past I didn't want to remember. My inheritance, the money my mother left me after years of hard work, was supposed to be untouchable. Mark had sworn he wouldn't touch it, but he had. The evidence was clear. Over the years, Mark had funneled small amounts into his own accounts under the guise of investments and joint expenses. He must have assumed I'd never notice. And for a long time I didn't. But now I had proof. I spent the next morning with Rebecca, combing through the files to make sure we could use them. "This changes everything," she said, flipping through the pages. "If we present this, it won't just strengthen your case. It'll destroy his credibility completely." I nodded, a sense of grim determination settling over me. "Good. Let's do it." Mark had built his life on appearances. He cared more about what people thought of him than what was real. His reputation as a savvy businessman and a charming husband was the foundation of his entire persona. I was about to shatter it. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. A mutual friend, Lisa, bless her gossip-loving heart, invited me to a dinner party where several of Mark's former colleagues and friends would be. I knew Mark wouldn't be there. His Miami dream kept him tethered to his crumbling fantasy life. As I walked into the party, clutching a folder of evidence, I felt a mixture of nerves and resolve. Lisa greeted me with a warm hug. "I'm so glad you came," she whispered. "People have been asking about you. And Mark, I'm sure they have," I replied, a small smile playing on my lips. After dinner, the conversation turned to Mark. One of his old business partners, Greg, shook his head and sighed. "Such a shame about what happened with Mark," he said. "I heard his nightclub deal fell through. Any idea what's going on, Emma?" I sipped my wine and set the glass down carefully. "Actually, I do," I said, my voice steady. All eyes turned to me. I opened the folder and slid a few copies of the documents across the table. "Mark's been hiding things for years. He stole money from our accounts, including my inheritance. These are the receipts." The room fell silent as people leaned in to read. I watched their faces shift from curiosity to shock. Lisa broke the silence. "Wait, he took your inheritance? That's low. Even for him." "It's worse than that," I continued. "He also funneled money into offshore accounts and tried to frame it as legitimate investments. He thought I'd never figure it out." Greg shook his head, visibly disgusted. "Unbelievable. I had no idea he was capable of this." Word spread quickly after that night. Within days, Mark's once loyal circle of friends and colleagues began distancing themselves. Lisa called me again, gleeful as always. "Greg's been telling everyone what you shared. Mark's name is mud right now. People are furious." "Good," I said simply. Mark, of course, couldn't handle the fallout. His texts became more frantic, oscillating between anger and desperation. "Emma, you've made your point. Can we please talk? I don't deserve this. Stop ruining my life. I'm sorry, okay? Let's work this out." Each message was another reminder of his arrogance. He still thought he could talk his way out of this. The final blow came when his girlfriend left him. Lisa sent me a screenshot of the breakup post on Instagram. "Moving on to bigger and better things. Lesson learned. Don't date men who live off their wives' money." I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. One evening, as I was reviewing the latest updates from Rebecca, my phone buzzed with another message from Mark. This one was different. "Emma, I don't know what else to say. I messed up, okay? I was stupid and selfish, and I ruined everything. Please, I'm begging you, can we talk? I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." For a moment, I just stared at the screen. Part of me wanted to respond, to call him out for every lie, every betrayal. But another part of me knew it didn't matter. Mark wasn't sorry for what he'd done. He was sorry he got caught. I didn't reply. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine and stepped onto the balcony, letting the cool night air wash over me. Mark's life was in ruins, but mine? Mine was just beginning. As I watched the city lights twinkle in the distance, I couldn't help but wonder, was this really the end, or was there more to uncover? Only time would tell. For the first time in years, I woke up with a sense of peace. No more waking up to Mark's cutting remarks or living under the shadow of his ego. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It felt full of possibility. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the morning sun spill across the garden. It was strange, almost surreal, to feel so light after the storm I'd just weathered. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of change. I started working on an idea that had been sitting in the back of my mind for years, a sustainable home goods business. Back when I'd mentioned it to Mark, he dismissed it with his trademark smugness. You'd lose more money than you'd make him. Don't waste your time. But now his opinion didn't matter. I rented a small studio space downtown and started sketching designs. With some of the money Rebecca had recovered, I hired a graphic designer to help me create branding and a website. The work felt good, honest, meaningful. It was mine, untouched by Mark's influence. Reconnecting with friends came next. For years, I'd let Mark isolate me, convincing me that my friends didn't really understand me or that they weren't on our level. But when I reached out, they welcomed me back with open arms. One night, over wine and laughter, my best friend Claire leaned across the table and said, "Emma, I'm so proud of you. You've been through hell, and look at you now." Her words brought tears to my eyes. For the first time in a long time, I felt like myself again. As I rebuilt my life, Mark's world continued to fall apart. Word of his betrayal had spread far beyond our social circle. His nightclub deal was officially dead, and his reputation as a businessman was in shambles. Through Lisa, I heard that he'd been forced to sell his Miami condo at a loss. His girlfriend had left him, and the friends who used to orbit him, like satellites, were nowhere to be found. I try not to think about him too much, but every now and then, I catch myself wondering what he was doing, whether he felt regret or if he was just angry that his house of cards had collapsed. One day, while cleaning out the closet in the spare room, I stumbled across an old journal. It was from the first year of our marriage, back when I still wrote down my thoughts regularly. Curious, I sat down on the floor and started flipping through the pages. The entries were a mix of hopeful optimism and small red flags I hadn't wanted to see at the time. Mark and I had our first fight today. He said I was overreacting, but I just wanted him to understand how I felt. I suggested a weekend trip to the mountains, but Mark said he's too busy. He said I shouldn't be so needy. Sometimes I wonder if Mark really sees me. But then he smiles, and it's like everything's okay again. As I read, a lump formed in my throat. How much of our relationship had been real? Had I convinced myself that love was enough to paper over the cracks? The journal entry that hit me hardest was one from our anniversary. Mark gave me a bracelet today. It's beautiful, but he didn't write a card. I don't know why, but it feels like he's going through the motions. Am I imagining things? Or am I losing him already? I closed the journal and set it aside, my chest tight. Maybe I'd never have the answers. Maybe Mark had loved me in his own way, or maybe he'd always been the man who left me for a younger woman and drained our bank account. But either way, it didn't matter anymore. Later that evening, I lit a candle in the studio and started sketching designs for my next collection. The doubts and pain lingered, but they didn't consume me. For the first time in years, I was in control of my story. As I stared at the blank canvas in front of me, I thought about the journal. Did I want to dig deeper to understand the cracks in my past? Or was it time to close the book for good? The choice was mine, and for once that felt like enough. The journal sat on my desk for days. I hadn't opened it since that night, but its presence was a constant reminder of everything I'd been through and everything I still didn't fully understand. By now, I had everything I needed to close the chapter on Mark for good. Rebecca had finalized the legal proceedings, securing the bulk of the money he'd tried to steal. His reputation was in tatters. His Miami dream reduced to nothing more than an embarrassing footnote in his life. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more I could do. One afternoon, Rebecca called with an update. "I've been reviewing the offshore account findings," she said. "There's a strong case for criminal charges if you want to pursue it." The words hung in the air between us. "Criminal charges?" I repeated. "Mark knowingly siphoned money from your inheritance," Rebecca said. "That's fraud, plain and simple. If you want, we can take this to the next level." It would mean more court time, more exposure, but the outcome could be significant. I thanked her and hung up, my mind swirling with possibilities. That evening, I walked through the studio, tracing my fingers along the edge of the workbench. The business was starting to take off. Orders were coming in steadily, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was building something that mattered. But Rebecca's words kept echoing in my mind. Did I want to keep fighting? Or was it time to let go? I thought about everything Mark had done. The lies, the betrayal, the arrogance. A part of me wanted to make sure he paid for every single mistake, to show him that I wasn't someone he could just walk all over. But another part of me wondered if I'd already won. He was alone, broke, and humiliated. The life he'd tried to build without me had crumbled, and I had emerged from the wreckage stronger than ever. Wasn't that enough? What would you do if you were me? Would you pursue justice no matter the cost? Or would you walk away and move on? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. The next morning, I drove to the beach. The air was crisp, and the waves crashed against the shore with a steady rhythm. I walked along the water's edge, letting the cold spray hit my skin. Each step felt lighter, freer. In my hand, I held the journal. It was heavy, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. It was a chronicle of my life with Mark, a story of love, loss, and betrayal. As I stood there, staring out at the endless expanse of water, I realized I didn't need the journal anymore. I didn't need to dwell on the past to understand my worth. I closed my eyes and let the breeze carry away the last of my doubts. When I got home, I called Rebecca. "Let's drop it," I said. "The criminal charges, the offshore accounts. It's not worth it." "Are you sure?" she asked. "Positive," I replied. "Mark's already lost everything that matters to him. I don't need to take it any further." Rebecca paused, then said, "I admire that, Emma. Not everyone could walk away like this." That night, I lit a fire in the backyard and tossed the journal into the flames. I watched as the pages curled and blackened, the words disappearing into smoke. It wasn't about forgetting. It was about freeing myself from the weight of it all. Ending scene. The next day, I returned to the beach. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the water. I stood at the edge of the ocean, the waves lapping at my feet. For the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. Mark's voice, his lies, his betrayal, they were all just echoes now, distant and fading. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew one thing. It was mine to shape. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I smiled to myself, a mix of triumph and quiet contemplation etched on my face. Was this the end of my story, or the beginning of something new? The answer didn't matter. I was free. The camera pans out, leaving Emma standing alone by the ocean, her future wide open. The audience is left to wonder. Has she truly let go, or is there more to come? Mark was never one to go quietly. That much I knew, but I hadn't expected him to come crawling back, trying to twist the narrative into something that painted him as the victim. It started with a post on his Instagram, a picture of him sitting on the balcony of a rundown apartment in Miami. The caption read, "Sometimes people destroy you just because they can." The comments section lit up. Some people took his side immediately, blaming me for his downfall. Others weren't so easily fooled, calling him out for his own actions. The backlash didn't stop him, though. He started reaching out to mutual friends, spinning tales about how my vindictive actions had ruined him. Lisa, ever my loyal friend, forwarded me one of his messages. "Emma's been lying to everyone. She's not as innocent as she pretends to be. I just want a chance to clear my name. Can't you help me?" I rolled my eyes when I read it. Mark's desperation was obvious, but I couldn't deny how calculated he was. He knew exactly how to manipulate people, tugging at their sympathy while conveniently leaving out the part where he drained our bank account and tried to hide money offshore. Some of our old acquaintances bought into it. One even texted me saying, "Maybe you should let up on him. He's clearly struggling." I deleted the message without responding. As Mark's efforts ramped up, I leaned on the people who truly mattered. Claire invited me over for dinner one night, sensing I needed a break. "You know this is just another one of his games, right?" she said, pouring me a glass of wine. "Of course," I replied, "but it's exhausting. Every time I think it's over, he finds a new way to drag me back in." Claire put a hand on my shoulder. "You've already won, Emma. Let him throw his tantrum. It doesn't change the fact that you're better off without him." She was right. The difference between me and Mark was that I had something real, a growing business, true friends, and a future that wasn't built on lies. That week, I focused on my work. The studio was thriving, orders coming in faster than I could keep up with. Every time I packaged a product or finalized a design, I felt a sense of purpose that Mark could never take away. But of course, Mark wasn't done yet. One evening, Rebecca called with news. "Emma, I need to let you know about something," she said, her tone cautious. "Mark's lawyer contacted me. They're claiming there's an error in your financial agreements." "What kind of error?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "They're saying one of the asset transfers during your divorce wasn't filed properly," she explained. "Mark's trying to argue that it gives him grounds to contest the settlement." I leaned back in my chair, the familiar frustration bubbling to the surface. "So now he thinks he can take back what he lost?" "Essentially," Rebecca replied. "But don't worry, we'll look into it. If it's a legitimate issue, we'll handle it. If it's not, we'll shut it down fast." That night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the darkened sky. Mark's move wasn't surprising, but it was still infuriating. He couldn't accept defeat. He couldn't let me go. But I wasn't going to let him pull me back into his chaos. Not again. What would you do if your ex tried to come back into your life, claiming they'd been wronged? Would you fight back? Or would you walk away? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Mark's claim hung over me like a dark cloud. Was it a desperate bluff? Or had he actually found a way to challenge my victory? Either way, I knew one thing. I wasn't backing down. Mark's latest attempt to claw his way back into relevance felt like a bad sequel. Predictable, desperate, and doomed to fail. But I wasn't about to underestimate him. Rebecca and I dove into his claim immediately, reviewing every detail of the financial agreements from the divorce. At first glance, it looked like a legitimate error. A single document missing a signature, leaving room for interpretation about the transfer of certain assets. I'll admit it's clever, Rebecca said during our meeting. But clever doesn't mean truthful. Let me dig deeper. A week later, she called with the answer I'd been waiting for. It's a bluff, she said, her voice filled with satisfaction. The document Mark's trying to contest isn't even relevant to the assets in question. He's banking on you not catching the technicality. Relief flooded through me, but it was tinged with anger. Mark's games had gone on long enough. What's our next step? I asked. Rebecca's grin was almost audible. We go public. The opportunity came during a local event where I was speaking about my new business. It wasn't a massive crowd, just a few dozen entrepreneurs and community members. But it was the perfect audience for what I had planned. As I wrapped up my presentation, I paused, letting the room settle into silence. There's one more thing I'd like to address, I said, my voice steady but firm. Some of you may have heard rumors about my former husband and his ongoing attempts to challenge the settlement from our divorce. A ripple of curiosity ran through the audience. I want to be clear, I continued, pulling out a folder and holding it up. These claims are baseless. Here's the proof. Every document, every signature, every legal detail that invalidates his accusations. I passed copies to the front row, letting the information trickle through the room. Mark Parker has built his life on manipulation and deception, I said, meeting the eyes of everyone present. But I refused to let him use those tactics against me, or anyone else, ever again. The fallout was immediate. Within days, the story spread beyond our small community. Articles popped up online, recounting Mark's downfall and my rise from the ashes of our marriage. Even some of his staunchest defenders began to distance themselves, realizing that his charm couldn't hide his deceit any longer. I didn't hear from Mark after that. Not a text, not a call, not even a cryptic Instagram post. He disappeared, his final ace exposed as nothing more than a dud. For the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe. With Mark out of the picture, I turned my full attention to the future. The business was thriving. Orders were coming in faster than I could fulfill them, and my small studio space wasn't cutting it anymore. With some of the money I'd recovered, I rented a storefront in the heart of downtown, a bright, airy space with big windows and plenty of room for growth. On opening day, the shop buzzed with life. Friends, old and new, came to celebrate, filling the space with laughter and love. Claire brought a bottle of champagne, and Lisa made sure everyone knew the story behind my success. You deserve this, Emma, Claire said, raising her glass in a toast. Here's to new beginnings. To new beginnings, I echoed, clinking my glass against hers. That evening, after everyone had left, I stood in the middle of the empty shop. The shelves were still half full with inventory, but the space felt alive, brimming with possibility. I walked to the window and looked out at the city, the soft glow of the streetlights casting a warm light on the sidewalk. This was my life now. Life has a funny way of surprising you, I thought. One day, you're at your lowest, and the next, you're standing in a place you never thought you'd reach. As I locked up for the night, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Was this my happy ending? Maybe. Or maybe it was just the beginning of something new.